Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is Paul King, Principal Mining Engineer with Mec Mining, working for Mec Advisory. Today I'll be running through a short webinar around decarbonisation of operating mines, navigating the right path. First of all, just a quick rundown on Mec Mining. So Mec is a global technical consulting firm, highly experienced personnel in a number of fields, largely around mining engineering, geotechnical engineering, exploration and geology, and our advisory services, with a little note there to watch this space on upcoming things. So services that we provide span full project lifecycle, include on-site technical support and management, scoping, pre-feasibility and feasibility studies, mine decarbonisation studies, mine closure and rehabilitation planning, and business improvement planning and management, amongst others. An overview of our global footprint for Mec, so you can see there clients scattered all over the globe, with our head offices in Perth and Brisbane in Australia. So navigating the right path. For us, really, this is about getting the direction from the start to set the right path for your decarbonisation project or projects. So very similar to other business improvement process or projects to navigate change in an operation. So the big ticket items here are around setting direction, sharpening focus, building plans, delivering these plans, and then evaluating the effectiveness of the plans. In terms of setting direction, so important first step for anything, this is about building a clear and holistic understanding of the emissions that you're producing. So understanding the source of emissions, downstream product use, fugitive emissions, diesel, electricity, all of those sorts of things. Quantifying the size of your emission sources. So understanding really what are the biggest contributors to your total emissions and where are these coming from? What's the size of them in all of the different buckets, if you will? Next piece is about understanding the level of control and influence that you can have on these and understanding which ones you can actually practically impact. So the comment there, the practical size of the manageable prize. As a bit of an example of what would be a fairly typical sort of operation, we've got a bunch of different bins there essentially for the emissions. So a large category as would be typical in mining for the end of use product. So whether that's into a furnace making steel or whatever other end use it may be into electronics products, etc. That's generally going to be quite a large bin, which falls under your scope 3 emissions. Going down these as well, you'll want to have a look at what are your big ticket items that you can actually control. So there will be a number of big ticket items that are not yet within your control or may never be within your control. So you can't focus on everything at once, as with any other process. So it's really important to actually identify which one of these big ticket items or which number of these big ticket items you can actually control and influence. There's a point there to note as well that lack of control of these may actually be driven from within your own organisation. So this is a good point to not discount your influence within your organisation. So based on these focus areas, I guess based on these areas, you can use this understanding to inform what your focus areas will be for upcoming projects. Sharpening your focus needs to happen from a holistic understanding, as we've discussed before. So this is locking in the big wins and locking in the do anyway items. So one of the big points for this as well is avoiding traps. This comes back to the holistic understanding of it. So you don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture when focusing on a narrow area, and you will focus on a narrow area because this is required to actually affect change within that area. So an example of this, when I say losing sight of the bigger picture, is biodiesel. So this is one of these items it's quite likely to actually increase scope 1 emissions, and your benefit that you'll realise from that will be in scope 3. And overall, it most likely will be a benefit. If you're only reporting and recording scope 1 and 2 emissions, this might be immediately rejected, whether it's by upper management or whether it's by a lack of understanding within the organisation of the actual impact of this. As an example of a focus area, we've just got the haul trucks or diesel usage in mining equipment. And that call out there really, that something typical that we've seen in our assessments is round numbers, ballpark 70% of diesel is used in the trucks within the mining equipment of a surface operation. So this is heavily dependent on the length and elevation of haulage, but this is the kind of number that we're typically seeing in our Australian mines. So it gives a fairly good picture of why there is a significant portion of focus on actually decarbonising the mining trucks. It gives a bit more context there on the other diesel usage within the other bulk mining machinery. So the next phase looking at is actually building plans around the identified focus areas. So a key point to this is entrenching emissions assessment and emissions management into your standard planning processes. So we've got the standard, whatever it is for different companies, different commodities, different parts of the business, there'd generally be some sort of a short-term, medium-term, long-term planning. So this is about building calculations into all these horizon levels and giving a lot of visibility to the emissions as required. The call out here too is to actually manage emissions in the same way that safety is managed. It is easy to look at emissions in the same light. It's probably a slightly longer term impact to safety and a slightly more abstract than a vehicle interaction, as you would see this immediately. But it is very much in the same light as any other safety on site and should really be managed as such. The side note on that as well is around managing the emissions as money gets managed. And this is really where it comes into the planning processes and being included in that. So the logical follow on to that, we're fairly comfortable with the concept of a net present value. So there's the consideration of net present carbon dioxide. So exactly the same process as an NPV or the same understanding. Carbon reduction today is worth more than carbon reduction tomorrow. So that's a very important thing to consider. And it's something that probably isn't included in a lot of plans, and it is a bit more difficult as an abstract concept to put in alongside or directly against an NPV. But it's very important to have this concept in mind when you're actually making longer term and even short term assessments. One of the key parts of this where this will come up, the next point there, just rethink your relationship with rehandle. So very typical for any sort of site where you've got a large variation in grade or a metallurgical recovery, for example, that essentially you've got a large flex in revenue or a potential for a large flex in revenue when you extract different material from the plant, from the mine. So generally what you'll end up with this, it's an NPV driven thing. A lot of these mines with high variability in grade and or recovery, you'll end up with large low grade stockpiles purely driven by the NPV and achieving that. In terms of the net present CO2, there's kind of two levers at play there. So the first one is additional material movement earlier in the mine life to actually get down to the higher grade or higher recovery material. And the secondary part later on is the actual additional carbon dioxide emission required for the rehandle of this material. So there's not a hard and fast rule for this. There's going to be a middle ground somewhere, and a lot of the time the NPV and the net present carbon are going to be at opposite ends in a bit of a money versus CO2 style battle. So definitely not an easy catch-all solution to this, but it's definitely something that needs to be considered in plans. The last point on this one as well is a target is not a plan. So it's very easy to fall into the trap of coming up with a number that needs to be hit and then assuming that the plan actually supports that. So the planning work needs to be done to actually support the target. And it's fine to have a target that informs the plan. That's an excellent way to move forward and figure out where you need to be. The same token, the plan needs to support it. So if you run through the planning process and the planning doesn't achieve the target, either the plan, the target, or both of them need to change. It's good to keep that in mind. Moving on to an example plan. So this is an overview of something that might be around a 10 plus sort of year plan for an operating mine site. So there's a number of steps in there. There's 5 different projects essentially, with a couple of them staged there as an example. Number 1 on there, the Power Zero, so net zero emissions power agreement. So this is very common now for sites. A lot of them in the greenfield phase, but even operating sites now to strike power agreements with their suppliers around low emissions or no emissions electricity supply. The other side to this as well is sites looking for their own microgrids with renewables to either supplement energy supply or wholly provide their energy supply to site. The next one on there we've got is a carbon reduction focused mine plan. So this is a do anyway. It's a do anyway win. It should be completed as part of your normal planning processes in the same light as any business improvement. The next one on there is a trolley assist. So it is a proven technology, which is why it's getting a lot more traction in plans as something that is readily available and realistic to implement today. So this is a partial electrification option. It's taking a diesel trolley and actually realizing the benefits now of having partial energy on the haul cycles electrified. Next one we've got on here is the full completion of truck electrification. So actually swapping out to battery, so removing diesel engines, replacing with electric motors and battery power as the source of energy in place of diesel. So in this case, most likely to be coupled with the trolley assist for charging. There may be flash charging and other options available as well as part of this. The call out there for this one and also for Project 5 is that this is a staged project. So one thing you'll see as well, it's most likely any of these big projects that involve fleet replacement or equipment conversions, it's going to be practical to roll it out in stages. And that's a combination of a few things. It's availability of workshop space, availability of labor, availability of parts to actually execute this. It's also allowing you to execute parts and gain learnings to do things more effectively as you step into the ensuing stages of the rollout. So the last one there is a hydrogen conversion of the dig units. So this one here, in the case of this plan, it is tackled right at the back end of the plan. And a lot of this is done by design, as it will actually rely on changes in machine technology as well as the supply of hydrogen. So there's nothing wrong with having something like this in your plan outline. It's just really that all the parts of the plan, as is the red call out on there, are backed by the right information. So this is a critical part of it, actually getting the right information at the right time. So something at the back end of the plan, it may be nowhere near as mature in the planning stage as what you're about to execute in 6 months' time. And that's fine, but it does need to get there. Still on the back end of a target not being a plan, it needs to get there prior to execution. And it may change multiple times in the lead up to that, but it needs to be locked in before you go in to actually execute. In the execution phase, so this is where the rubber hits the road. It's the important part where changes are made and the benefits are realized. So depending on the actual project you're doing or projects you're doing, this might be highly variable. So it could be around building infrastructure. It might be around striking an agreement acquiring assets, executing designs, achieving schedules. There'll be multiple parts of this, multiple people involved. It is the important part though. So important point for this too is while there needs to be appropriate contingency and redundancy in the planning, so built into the actual planning, execution teams need to have enough inbuilt resilience to make it happen. So that's an extremely important point. There's not a point there you get to and, the plan is not perfect. The plan's never perfect. It's very easy to blame the plan. It's about having the right resilience in the execution teams as well as having that contingency in the plan. In the evaluation phase, so this is really, it's in execution or execution is completed. It's all running, it's all happening. The evaluation phase is actually critical to assessing your performance. So how well has the thing, whatever it may be, performed against what it's set out to achieve? So this is something that really needs to be clearly and thoroughly documented, and it needs to capture learnings or real-time improvements for future rollouts or reattempts. So the important part of that is if something's not working in the middle of a project as intended, it needs to be obvious that it's not working, and there need to be steps in place to manage it and rectify it. So a couple of the big points for that, in tracking performance, you really need clear KPIs or metrics that drive the outcomes required. So easy again to fall into the trap of setting very, very easy to set and measure KPIs. They need to be the correct KPIs. And if they're difficult to measure, everyone needs to work to actually find a way to make it easy to communicate the information and measure them accurately. So the KPI shouldn't be dictated on what's immediately easy to measure. It needs to be something that actually measures the effectiveness of what you set out to achieve. Management of issues. So management and rectification of issues that are identified is a lot simpler and a lot more effective when there are clear goals. So clear KPIs that work, make sense, easily accessible information, as well as clear processes in place to actually manage them. So the big thing in here is to not underestimate the human element of this in issue management. It is a massive piece of it. The last call out on there is really to seek opportunities. So you may have executed the thing, whatever it may be. Often there will be other additional wins and other angles that you can work, and they may only become apparent in the execution phase. Ideally, they'll become apparent early, or you'll have some inkling that there's an option there, and you may get clarity during execution, or you may get better clarity as technologies emerge. There's no rule against improving a plan, but again, it's important to not change for the sake of change. So touching back to the human element, constant change is very difficult for people in general to deal with. So you may have a better plan, but it needs to be the most effective outcome overall that you actually go for. So in a summary of navigating the right path to decarbonising operating mines, treat it like a high value business improvement project, because that's exactly what it is. So 10 steps there to success. So gain a holistic understanding, fully appreciate what you're actually looking at, what you need to do. Use this understanding to select your focus areas. So knowing what you can impact, what you can change, and focusing on those. Avoiding traps and not exploiting loopholes. Building detailed and practical plans. So emphasis on the practicality there. It needs to be a plan that's achievable and actually gets to the target that you've set out. Number 6 there, start now. So looking back to that net present carbon, reduction now is greater than reduction later. Rethink your relationship with rehandle. Emphasis on a target not being a plan. So ensure you make a plan that really supports what you need to achieve. Closely track your performance and seek further opportunities. Always continue to seek further opportunities. Thank you very much for your attention.